Rejection has a way of hitting harder than most people expect. One moment, everything feels possible. There is connection, conversation, shared attention. Then suddenly, something shifts. Their tone changes, their presence fades, their words become distant. And just like that, you are left sitting with a question that feels impossible to answer. What just happened? In that moment, confusion takes over. Your mind starts searching for reasons. You replay conversations, looking for mistakes. You analyze your words, your timing, your reactions. You wonder if you said too much, or maybe not enough. Self-doubt begins to grow quietly, filling the space where certainty once lived. And almost without realizing it, the instinct to chase begins. You feel the urge to reach out again, to fix what feels broken, to prove that the connection mattered. Because when someone pulls away or rejects you, it can feel like everything you shared suddenly lost its value. It feels personal. It feels final, like the story ended before it had the chance to fully unfold. Most people react emotionally in this stage. They assume rejection means the feelings were never real. They believe distance equals disinterest, that silence means the connection meant less than they thought. And that belief creates panic, not just about losing the person, but about losing the meaning behind what once felt genuine. But here is the part most people never stop to consider. What looks like rejection on the surface is not always the full story. Sometimes what feels like an ending is actually a reaction to something deeper happening inside them, something you cannot see, something they may not even fully understand themselves. And that possibility changes everything. After the initial shock fades, a deeper question begins to surface. Why would someone walk away when things seem to be going well? Why reject a connection that felt genuine, steady, and full of potential? To understand this, you have to look beneath behavior and into psychology. Because for someone with avoidant tendencies, rejection is rarely about a lack of feeling. More often, it is triggered by the exact opposite. Feelings that become too strong, too fast, or too real for them to manage comfortably. When emotional closeness begins to deepen, most people feel excitement or security. But for an avoidant, that same closeness can activate discomfort. Not because the connection is wrong, but because it feels unfamiliar and risky. The closer they get to someone, the more they begin to sense vulnerability. And vulnerability to them can feel like exposure rather than connection. This is where the misunderstanding usually begins. From the outside, their withdrawal looks cold. It looks intentional. It looks like disinterest. But inside, what often happens is emotional overload. The connection starts to matter, and that creates pressure they do not know how to handle. They begin to feel the weight of expectations, attachment, and the possibility of loss. And instead of moving closer, their instinct tells them to step back. Closeness for them can feel overwhelming in ways that are difficult to explain. It may trigger memories of past disappointments, broken trust, or moments where relying on someone led to pain. So when emotions deepen, distance begins to feel like protection, not punishment, not rejection in the way it appears on the surface. Protection from the fear of losing control, from the fear of being hurt, or from the fear of needing someone too much. This is why rejection from an avoidant can feel so confusing. It often happens at the exact moment when connection starts to feel meaningful. Just when things appear to be growing stronger, they create space. Not because they feel nothing, but because they feel too much. Understanding this changes the way you interpret rejection. Instead of seeing it only as indifference, you begin to recognize that fear can hide behind distance, that stepping away can sometimes be a response to emotional intensity rather than a sign that the connection never mattered. And when you realize that fear, not lack of care, can drive rejection, the situation begins to look very different. After rejection, emotions rarely stay quiet. There is an immediate urge to fix what feels broken, to restore what once felt secure. And this is exactly where most people make the mistake that unknowingly pushes an avoidant even further away. The most common reaction after rejection is chasing. Not always in obvious ways, but in emotional ones. Sending longer messages than usual, trying to explain feelings in greater detail, asking for clarity again and again, hoping that one more conversation will change their mind. It feels reasonable in the moment. If something matters to you, your instinct is to fight for it, to prove its value. But with someone who already feels overwhelmed by closeness, this reaction creates the exact pressure they are trying to escape. Over-explaining becomes another hidden form of pressure. You try to make them understand your intentions, your feelings, your loyalty. You explain why the connection is meaningful, why it deserves another chance, why walking away might be a mistake. Yet the more words you use to hold the connection together, the heavier it begins to feel on their side. Then comes demanding clarity, wanting answers, wanting certainty, asking questions that feel urgent and emotionally loaded. Questions like why they changed, why they pulled away, why they cannot just stay. These questions come from pain, but to an avoidant, they can feel like emotional weight being placed directly on them. And when pressure increases, their instinct strengthens, not to move closer, but to create more distance. This is not because they enjoy hurting others or avoiding responsibility. It happens because pressure activates their deepest fears. The fear of losing independence, the fear of being overwhelmed, the fear of expectations they may not feel ready to meet. The more intensity they sense, the more their protective instincts take control. What many people do not realize is that reactions after rejection often shape what happens next. Not just in the short term, but in the long term as well. When responses are driven by panic, urgency, or emotional intensity, they reinforce the avoidance belief that closeness leads to pressure. That connection leads to discomfort. But when reactions shift, outcomes can shift too. Because sometimes, it is not rejection itself that creates permanent distance. It is the reaction that follows it. After rejection, most people believe the solution is to do more. More explaining, more reaching out, more effort to prove their importance. But what an avoidant secretly wishes for is often the exact opposite of what most people naturally do. They wish for steadiness. Not silence filled with resentment, not distance used as punishment, but emotional steadiness, the ability to remain calm without turning cold. This is the core shift that changes everything, and it is also the promise at the heart of this transformation. Because when you respond differently than expected, the emotional dynamic begins to change in ways most people never anticipate. Giving space is the first part of this shift, but space does not mean disappearing or pretending you never cared. It means allowing distance without reacting from fear. It means resisting the urge to fill every silence with words or every pause with questions. For someone who feels overwhelmed easily, this kind of space feels like relief rather than abandonment. Many people confuse space with rejection, so they respond with hostility or emotional withdrawal. They become cold, distant, or defensive in return. But that reaction creates tension instead of safety. It turns the connection into a silent battle rather than a calm environment. What they secretly hope for is something quieter, a response that does not carry pressure, blame, or emotional weight. Calm responses create relief. When you remain steady instead of reactive, it sends a powerful message without using words. It shows that you are not trying to control the outcome. It shows that your emotions are grounded rather than unstable. And this kind of emotional control creates something rare, a sense of safety. Safety reduces resistance. When someone expects pressure but instead experiences calmness, their defenses do not activate as strongly. They feel less urgency to escape, less need to protect themselves. And slowly, without force, tension begins to ease. This is the unexpected response that changes the emotional dynamic. Not chasing, not proving, not demanding answers, but staying composed, giving room to breathe, and allowing emotions to settle without interference. Because sometimes, the most powerful move after rejection is not intensity, it is restraint. Silence, after rejection, often feels uncomfortable. It creates uncertainty, leaves questions unanswered, and gives your mind too much room to overthink. Most people rush to fill that silence because they believe distance weakens connection. But when handled correctly, silence and space can actually rebuild something that rejection often damages: respect. Not forced respect, but natural respect that grows when someone sees strength instead of emotional chaos. Controlled distance is different from emotional withdrawal. It is not about ignoring them or pretending you no longer care. It is about choosing not to react impulsively. When emotions are high, the urge to respond quickly feels almost automatic. You want to send another message, ask another question, or explain your feelings one more time. But resisting that impulse shows something powerful: self-control. And self-control is often interpreted as strength. When you do not react immediately, it changes how you are perceived. Instead of appearing overwhelmed or desperate for answers, you appear stable. Someone who can handle uncertainty without losing balance. Someone who does not allow emotions to dictate every action. This creates a quiet shift in how they view you, even if they never say it directly. Maintaining personal stability during silence also changes the emotional environment around the connection. When your life continues without dramatic reactions, without visible panic, it sends a clear signal that your world does not collapse in their absence. That sense of independence makes you feel safe rather than overwhelming. For an avoidant, feeling overwhelmed is often the trigger that creates distance. But when your presence feels steady, calm, and predictable, their need to maintain distance begins to weaken. They no longer feel like they must defend their space as strongly as before. This is where respect quietly begins to rebuild, not through grand gestures or emotional speeches, but through consistency and restraint. Respect often grows in moments where nothing dramatic happens, in pauses where you choose patience instead of urgency, in silence where you remain grounded instead of reactive. Many people believe dramatic actions prove strength, but in situations like this, the opposite is often true. Quiet discipline, controlled distance, and emotional balance send a stronger message than any emotional display ever could. Because when silence is handled with confidence, it stops feeling like loss and starts becoming a source of strength. Time has a quiet way of changing perspectives, especially when reactions are replaced with consistency. What once felt final can begin to feel uncertain again, not because words were exchanged, but because behavior created space for reflection. This is where the real turning point begins, not loudly, but internally. At first, nothing seems different. Days pass, communication may remain limited or absent, but beneath the surface, something subtle begins to shift. When they notice that you did not react with panic, did not chase endlessly, and did not collapse emotionally after rejection, curiosity slowly starts to form. They begin to wonder why you responded differently than expected. Consistency plays a powerful role here. When your life continues with stability, your routines remain intact, your focus stays on your own growth, and your emotional balance stays steady, it creates a contrast. They expected pressure. Instead, they saw independence. They expected emotional chaos. Instead, they saw control. That contrast invites reflection. Independence sends a message without words. It shows that your sense of value does not depend on their approval. And when someone realizes that you did not lose yourself after rejection, it forces them to reconsider the meaning of what happened. They may begin asking themselves questions they did not consider before. Questions about whether they acted too quickly, whether distance solved anything, whether walking away truly brought relief. This is where absence, when combined with strength, becomes powerful. Not absence meant to punish, but absence filled with purpose. When you remain focused on your own direction rather than waiting in uncertainty, it creates a quiet form of attraction. They begin to notice the space you once filled. They begin to recognize the stability you brought into their life. And then, small signs begin to appear. Not dramatic gestures, not sudden confessions, but subtle behavioral changes. A message that feels less guarded. A response that arrives sooner than expected. A tone that feels slightly warmer than before. These moments may seem small, but they carry meaning. They signal reconsideration, the beginning of renewed interest forming beneath the surface. This is the turning point where rejection stops feeling permanent and starts becoming something reconsidered, one quiet realization at a time. By the time you reach this stage, something important has already changed, not just in them, but in you. The confusion that once controlled your reactions begins to fade, replaced by clarity about what truly matters. Because the final move is not about doing something dramatic. It is about becoming someone steady enough that their return feels safe, not pressured. This is where empowerment begins. Self-respect becomes your foundation. After rejection, it is easy to lose yourself in the process of trying to fix what went wrong. You may feel tempted to adjust your personality, hide your needs, or lower your standards just to keep the connection alive. But lasting attraction is never built on self-abandonment. It is built on the quiet confidence that you can stand firm in who you are, even when outcomes feel uncertain. Emotional discipline plays a major role here, not the kind that suppresses feelings, but the kind that manages them. Instead of reacting impulsively to every change in their behavior, You learn to respond with awareness. You allow emotions to exist without letting them control your actions. This creates a sense of stability that others can feel, even without explanation. And stability is what makes someone feel safe to return. When they see that your identity did not collapse after rejection, that your confidence did not depend on their presence, it changes how they view you. You are no longer someone chasing reassurance. You become someone grounded, someone who respects both their space and your own worth. At this point, the goal itself begins to shift. It is no longer about winning them back or proving your value. It becomes about strengthening yourself emotionally so that your sense of peace does not rely on their decisions. This reframing is powerful because it removes desperation from the connection. It replaces need with balance. And balance creates attraction that feels natural rather than forced. Whether they return or not, this is the strongest position you can stand in. Because confidence built on self-respect does not fade when circumstances change. It remains steady, independent of outcomes. The final takeaway is simple but powerful. The true strength after rejection